The road was nearly empty as Rebecca Smith guided her black sedan through the quiet suburban streets. The evening sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. For most, this would be a moment of peace, but for Rebecca, it was just another fragment of a long, taxing day. As the director of the FBI, Rebecca's responsibilities often consumed her, leaving little room for the simple pleasures of life. Tonight, however, she was eager to get home, sink into her chair, and forget about work for a while. She was a woman of poise, confidence, and competence. With decades of experience under her belt, Rebecca had earned her place among the most respected figures in law enforcement. Yet she also knew all too well that even her title couldn't shield her from the prejudices she faced daily. The world wasn't blind to her achievements, it was blind to her humanity. The rhythmic sound of her tires on the pavement was interrupted by the sudden glare of red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. The shrill wail of a siren followed. Rebecca's stomach dropped. She immediately checked her speedometer. 42 in a 45 zone. Perfectly legal. Her indicators had been used, and her registration was current. There was no reason for this stop, and yet, she already suspected why it was happening. Suppressing a wave of frustration, Rebecca sighed and signaled to pull over. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as her car came to a halt on the shoulder. She glanced at the rearview mirror and saw a tall, white police officer stepping out of his cruiser, his figure silhouetted by the flashing lights. He approached her car with measured steps, his flashlight already drawn, its beams slicing through the dusk and into her rear window. Rebecca rolled down her window, the crisp evening air brushing her face. She waited for the officer to speak, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. The officer, Michael Harper, leaned down, his expression hard and unreadable. The flashlight aimed directly at her face made her squint. "License and registration?" Harper barked. His voice was devoid of pleasantries or explanations. Rebecca kept her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, her movements deliberate and calm. "Officer, may I ask why I've been stopped?" Harper didn't respond immediately. Instead, his flashlight darted around the interior of her car, as though searching for something, anything, that might justify his stop. When he finally spoke, his words were dismissive. "Routine check. Just hand over your license and registration." Routine check. Rebecca knew better. There was no routine in this. His voice, his demeanor, his intense scrutiny, they all screamed of one thing: profiling. She fought the urge to challenge him outright, knowing that escalation could make things worse. Instead, she spoke calmly. "I'll retrieve my license from the console and my registration from the glove compartment, officer." Slowly, Harper ordered, his hand drifting toward his holstered weapon. Rebecca's chest tightened. With deliberate care, she reached into the center console and then the glove compartment, retrieving the requested documents. Her FBI credentials were discreetly tucked behind her license, visible only if Harper took the time to look closely. She handed him the documents and waited as he scrutinized them. Harper glanced at the license and registration for barely a moment before shifting his focus back to her. His flashlight lingered on her face, as though her existence alone was an affront to his authority. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked sharply. Rebecca met his gaze, her voice firm. "Driving home." "Is there an issue, officer?" Harper smirked, a condescending expression that sent a wave of anger coursing through Rebecca. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Suspicious activity. The phrase was as vague as it was weaponized. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Am I suspected of a crime?" Instead of answering, Harper stepped back and gestured for her to exit the vehicle. "Step out of the car." Rebecca's stomach dropped. She hesitated, weighing her options. Refusing could escalate the situation. Complying would mean enduring further humiliation. She decided on the latter, though every fiber of her being rebelled against it. She opened the door and stepped out, her every movement measured to avoid giving him an excuse to act. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Harper commanded. Rebecca's blood boiled, but she complied. The cool metal of the hood met her palms as Harper began his search, his hands patting down her arms, sides, and legs. It was an act of degradation, devoid of any real justification. Rebecca gritted her teeth, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Is there anything in the car I need to know about? Harper asked, his tone accusatory. Weapons? No, officer, Rebecca replied, her voice clipped. You won't find anything because I've done nothing wrong. We'll see about that, Harper muttered. He moved back to the car, yanking open the driver's side door. Rebecca straightened, her fists clenching at her sides as she watched him rifle through her belongings without consent. Harper rummaged through the glove compartment, the center console, and the back seat. His flashlight illuminated every corner of the car, searching for something, anything, to justify his actions. When he opened the trunk, he found a neatly packed gym bag and a folder of documents. Picking up the folder, his flashlight caught the faint glint of the FBI's logo embossed on one of the pages. What's this? Harper asked, holding up the folder. You some kind of agent or something? Rebecca met his gaze evenly. I work in law enforcement, she said, keeping her response intentionally vague. Harper's smirk widened, his posture oozing condescension. Funny. You'd think someone in law enforcement would know better than to act suspicious. Rebecca felt her composure slipping. Suspicious how? By driving while black? Harper's face darkened. Watch your tone. Rebecca took a step forward, her voice rising despite herself. You stopped me without cause, searched my car without consent, and now you're trying to manufacture a justification. This isn't law enforcement. It's harassment. Harper's hand instinctively hovered near his weapon. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken hostility. I'd be careful if I were you, he said coldly. You people always think you're above the rules. Rebecca's chest tightened at the phrase. You people, she repeated, her voice sharp. Harper's smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. You people. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with the weight of decades of systemic prejudice and personal indignation. Rebecca stood her ground, her eyes locked on Harper's, refusing to let him strip away her dignity. Yet, in this moment, she knew the battle wasn't just hers. It was a reflection of a much larger struggle, one that she had fought her entire life and would continue to fight long after this humiliating encounter ended. Rebecca's breath came slow and steady, but inside, her mind raced. She had faced countless adversaries throughout her career, some of them deadly, others insidious, but this was a battlefield she knew all too well. The unwarranted aggression, the prejudice, the dehumanizing weight of systemic racism. She had prepared herself for such moments countless times, yet the reality was no less infuriating. Officer Harper stood a few feet away, holding the folder with her FBI documents, his smirk cutting through the growing darkness like a blade. The mockery in his eyes was unmistakable, as though her credentials were a joke to him. He tossed the folder onto the car's hood, the papers scattering like discarded leaves. Nice try, he sneered, his hand still hovering close to his holstered weapon. You really expect me to believe this? A black woman in this car, dressed like this, in this neighborhood? Director of the FBI? What's next, Queen of England? Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. She had dealt with men like him before, men who used their position to mask their insecurities, who felt emboldened by the authority granted to them but wielded it like a cudgel against the vulnerable. I don't care what you believe, she said, her voice firm but measured. You violated my rights without cause. This is harassment. Harper's smirk faded, replaced by a sneer that twisted his features. He stepped closer, his flashlight now aimed directly at her chest, the beam cutting through the night. Harassment? Big words for someone who's about to have a very bad night. You know what I think? I think you're hiding something. Maybe drugs, stolen property, something you don't want me to find. Rebecca met his gaze unflinchingly. And what makes you think that, Officer Harper? Is it the color of my skin? The car I'm driving? Or just the fact that you can't stand the idea of a black woman who doesn't cower under your authority? His nostrils flared, and for a moment, the mask of professionalism slipped entirely. Watch your mouth, he spat, his voice low and threatening. I'm not the one who should be explaining themselves. You're the one who doesn't belong here. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest, Not from fear but from sheer, burning anger. She could feel the humiliation bubbling up, threatening to crack her calm exterior. This wasn't just about her. It was about every time she had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated because of her skin color. It was about every black man and woman who had faced the same treatment, many without the privilege of walking away unscathed. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said, her voice quieter now but no less resolute. "I've told you who I am. My identification is in front of you. You know this is wrong." "Wrong?" Harper took another step forward, now just inches from her. His presence was suffocating, his tone dripping with derision. "You think you can lecture me about right and wrong? Let me tell you what's wrong. People like you thinking you're untouchable. That badge in your little folder doesn't mean a damn thing out here. Out here, I'm the one in charge." He reached out and flicked her FBI identification with his finger, sending it spinning across the hood of the car. Rebecca's patience frayed further, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She wanted to yell, to demand accountability, but she knew any reaction could be used against her. Harper stepped back, his smirk returning as he began circling her. His flashlight's beam danced over her figure, a harsh and invasive light that made her skin crawl. "You know, I've seen your type before," he said. "All dressed up, pretending you're better than the rest of us. But at the end of the day, you're just another." "Don't," Rebecca cut him off sharply, her voice like steel. The unspoken word hung in the air between them, heavy and vile. Harper's lips twitched, his smirk faltering for a moment before it returned, nastier than before. "What are you going to do about it?" he taunted, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon. The motion was slow, deliberate, a predator toying with its prey. "Call your FBI buddies? Go ahead. Let's see how far you get." The threat wasn't veiled, it was as overt as the flashing lights casting shadows over the roadside. Rebecca felt the weight of his aggression pressing down on her, her anger warring with the instinct to stay calm. She had faced down criminals armed with far more than a badge and a gun, but this felt different. This wasn't about justice or law. It was about power, wielded recklessly and cruelly. Harper leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think you're special because of that badge? Out here, you're just another black woman with an attitude. And let me tell you something, attitude gets you nowhere." Rebecca felt the sting of humiliation rise like bile in her throat. He wasn't just degrading her, he was stripping her of her humanity, reducing her to a stereotype, a caricature. Her composure cracked and her voice rose. "You're a disgrace to the badge you wear. You're not upholding the law, you're abusing it." Harper's face contorted with anger. He stepped back and unclipped the strap on his holster, his hand now fully resting on the weapon. "You better watch yourself," he said, his voice a growl. "One wrong move, and I'll have every right to take you down." Rebecca's heart pounded as the reality of the moment crystallized. This man was willing to do anything to assert his dominance, even if it meant escalating to violence. She forced herself to stay still, her hands visible, her voice even. "You've already crossed every line, Officer Harper. You think threatening me makes you a man? It only makes you a coward." For a moment, silence reigned, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Harper's hand twitched on his weapon, his eyes blazing with fury. Then, slowly, he stepped back, though the hostility in his posture remained. He was on the edge, teetering between action and restraint. Rebecca held her ground, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Inside, she burned with the desire to fight back, to use her position and power to hold him accountable. But here, on this roadside, she was just another black woman, her status invisible, her dignity under siege. Rebecca's hands trembled as she discreetly slid her phone from her pocket. Every ounce of her training told her this was a calculated risk, but she couldn't let Officer Harper's actions go unchallenged. She tapped the screen, activating the camera, and held it steady at her side. The lens caught Harper's towering figure, his smug expression, and his hands still hovering dangerously close to his holstered weapon. The red recording dot felt like a lifeline, a silent witness to his abuse of power. "What are you doing?" Harper's voice was sharp as he noticed the movement. His flashlight zeroed in on her phone, illuminating the recording screen. "Put that down." "No." Rebecca didn't flinch. "I'm documenting this unlawful stop and your unprofessional behavior," she said, her voice firm despite the storm of emotions churning within her. Harper's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl of open hostility. "Turn it off," he ordered, stepping closer. "You don't have permission to film me." "I don't need your permission," Rebecca countered, her tone unwavering. "And if you touch me or try to stop me, it'll only make this worse for you." His hand tightened on the grip of his weapon, his knuckles white against the black material. For a moment, Rebecca thought he might draw it, but he didn't. Instead, he sneered and spat on the ground near her feet. "You think you're smart, huh? Think you can just wave that phone around and make me back off?" Rebecca's pulse raced, but she kept her composure. "This isn't about me, Officer Harper. It's about your abuse of power and your blatant racism. I'll make sure everyone sees what kind of man you are." Harper laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "You think anyone's going to care? You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, the flashlight beam blinding her. "You're just another loudmouth with a phone. No one gives a damn about your little video." Rebecca didn't respond. She didn't need to. The camera captured every word, every threat, every hateful look he threw her way. She knew that in the court of public opinion, this recording could be powerful. But she also knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. She needed someone with authority to intervene. Keeping her phone angled to continue recording, Rebecca took a deep breath and said, "I'm calling the sheriff." Harper's smirk faltered. "What?" "You heard me." Rebecca's fingers danced across her phone screen, dialing the number for the county sheriff's office. Harper's sneer returned, but it was tinged with uncertainty now, a flicker of doubt breaking through his bravado. "Go ahead," he taunted, stepping back slightly. "Call whoever you want. You think I'm scared of some desk jockey in a cowboy hat?" The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. "Sheriff James Nolan speaking." "Sheriff Nolan, this is Rebecca Smith. I'm currently being harassed and unlawfully detained by one of your deputies, Officer Michael Harper," Rebecca said, her voice clear and authoritative. "I'm recording the interaction, and I need you to come to the scene immediately." There was a pause on the line, and then Nolan's voice hardened. "Where are you?" Rebecca provided her location, glancing briefly at Harper, who was now pacing near his cruiser, muttering under his breath. The sheriff responded quickly. "Stay put. I'll be there in 5 minutes." The line disconnected, and Rebecca pocketed her phone, the recording still running. Harper had stopped pacing and was now leaning against his cruiser, his arms crossed and his expression sour. "So, what's your plan?" he jeered. "Think your little call to the sheriff is going to scare me? He's my boss. You think he's going to take your side?" Rebecca didn't answer. She stood silently, her phone capturing every second of his behavior. The minutes felt like hours, the tension thick enough to choke on. Harper's false confidence seemed to waver the longer the silence stretched, his muttering growing louder as he glanced down the road repeatedly. Then, the distant wail of a siren pierced the air. A second set of flashing lights appeared, growing brighter as a white SUV pulled up behind Harper's cruiser. The vehicle's door opened, and out stepped Sheriff James Nolan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt-and-pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He adjusted his hat and approached the scene, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Sheriff Nolan," Harper greeted him, his tone forced and overly casual. "Glad you're here. We've got a situation." "Save it," Nolan interrupted, his voice cold as his sharp eyes swept over the scene. They lingered on Rebecca, taking in her composed but firm posture, before settling on Harper. "What the hell is going on here?" Harper hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the sheriff's tone. "Well, I stopped this vehicle because it seemed suspicious and—" Nolan raised a hand, cutting him off again. "Suspicious how?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Well," Harper stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating, "it's just, late, and this isn't exactly her neighborhood." Nolan's expression darkened. "And that's your justification? Not her neighborhood? Are you serious, Harper?" Rebecca stepped forward, holding up her phone. "Sheriff, I have everything recorded, including his threats and his baseless accusations." He searched my car without consent and made several racist remarks. Nolan's jaw tightened as he looked between Rebecca and Harper. Is that true, Officer Harper? Harper shifted uncomfortably, his hand dropping away from his weapon. I was just doing my job. Enough, Nolan snapped. I've heard enough. He turned to Rebecca. Miss Smith, I apologize for this officer's behavior. Rest assured, this will be addressed immediately. Rebecca's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the tension of the encounter still lingered. Thank you, Sheriff. Nolan turned back to Harper, his voice steely. Harper, hand over your badge and weapon. As of this moment, you're suspended. What? Harper's voice rose, incredulous. You're taking her side over mine? She's just some... Don't finish that sentence, Nolan warned, his eyes blazing. You've embarrassed this department enough for one night. Give me your badge and gun. No. Harper hesitated but finally complied, unbuckling his belt and handing over his firearm and badge with a sullen expression. Nolan didn't waver, pocketing them before stepping closer to Harper. You're done here, the sheriff said firmly. Go home. I'll deal with you later. Harper stomped back to his cruiser, his face twisted in rage and humiliation. He slammed the door shut and sped off, his taillights disappearing into the night. Nolan turned back to Rebecca, his expression softening slightly. Miss Smith, I assure you this will be handled properly. If there's anything else you need... There is, Rebecca said, her voice calm but firm. I want to ensure this recording reaches the right people. This isn't just about me. It's about accountability. Nolan nodded. You have my word. For the first time that night, Rebecca felt a flicker of relief. The fight wasn't over, but a battle had been won. The following morning, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table, her phone resting in front of her, the recording from the previous night paused on its final frame. She had watched the footage multiple times, reliving the humiliation, the aggression, and the unchecked racism of Officer Harper's actions. Each viewing solidified her resolve. This wasn't just about what happened to her, it was about ensuring no one else endured what she had. She sipped her coffee, her mind already racing ahead to the steps she needed to take. The sheriff, James Nolan, had promised accountability, but Rebecca knew from experience that words were easy. Real change required pressure, evidence, and vigilance. She had already sent the video to her attorney, who assured her it was damning enough to spark a full internal investigation. Now, it was time to make sure the investigation wasn't just another exercise in damage control. Later that day, Rebecca walked into the county sheriff's office, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. Heads turned as she entered, her presence commanding attention. It was clear that news of the previous night's incident had already spread. Whispers followed her as she approached the reception desk, where a young deputy nervously greeted her. Miss Smith, he stammered, his eyes darting to the badge clipped to her blazer. Sheriff Nolan is expecting you. Right this way. Rebecca followed him down a corridor lined with photographs of past sheriffs, their stoic faces staring out from gilded frames. The irony wasn't lost on her. Those men had presided over the same system that had allowed people like Harper to abuse their power for generations. Sheriff Nolan stood as she entered his office, his expression somber. Miss Smith, thank you for coming. Sheriff, Rebecca said, taking the seat he offered. She placed her phone on his desk and met his gaze evenly. I assume you've seen the video? I have, Nolan replied, his voice heavy. And I'll be honest with you, it's worse than I imagined. I've already forwarded it to Internal Affairs, and they've opened an investigation. Officer Harper has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Administrative leave? That's a slap on the wrist. He should be terminated. Nolan sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't disagree, but we have procedures to follow. Internal Affairs needs to conduct a thorough investigation. If we don't do this by the book, it could jeopardize the case. Rebecca nodded, though the explanation did little to ease her frustration. She had seen too many investigations buried under bureaucracy, too many offenders walking away with nothing more than a warning. I understand the process, Sheriff, but let me be clear, I won't let this fade away. Harper's actions weren't just misconduct, they were a blatant abuse of power fueled by racism. I intend to see this through. Nolan's jaw tightened. "You have my word, Miss Smith. We'll see justice done." 2 days later, Rebecca sat in a stark conference room at the Internal Affairs Division, her attorney beside her. Across the table sat 3 investigators, 2 men and a woman, reviewing the case files and the video evidence she had provided. A large monitor on the wall displayed the paused recording, Harper's menacing figure frozen mid-taunt. One of the investigators, a gray-haired man with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "Miss Smith, thank you for coming in. We've reviewed the footage you submitted, and I have to say, it's compelling. It paints a very clear picture of Officer Harper's behavior." Rebecca folded her hands on the table. "What's the next step?" The woman investigator, whose nameplate read Lieutenant Monroe, spoke up. "We've already started interviewing witnesses, including the other officers Harper worked with. We've also pulled his personnel file. Unfortunately, this isn't the first complaint against him." Rebecca's stomach churned. "How many complaints?" Monroe exchanged a glance with her colleagues. 4 formal complaints in the last 2 years. Allegations of excessive force, racial bias, and unprofessional conduct. None of them resulted in disciplinary action. "Why am I not surprised?" Rebecca said, her voice cold. "And you're telling me this man was still allowed to patrol the streets?" Another investigator, a younger man with a hesitant demeanor, shifted uncomfortably. The complaints were either dismissed for lack of evidence or resolved with verbal warnings. "It's not uncommon in cases like these." Rebecca's attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Eleanor Wright, interjected. "And what steps are you taking now to ensure this case doesn't end the same way?" Monroe straightened. "We're treating this case with the utmost seriousness. The video evidence is crucial, but we need more. We're reviewing Harper's body cam footage, dashcam footage, and his patrol logs. We've also subpoenaed his communications to look for any patterns of bias or misconduct." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with anger. Harper's behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that allows officers like him to operate unchecked. If you're serious about accountability, then you need to look beyond this one incident. Monroe nodded. "We're aware of that, Miss Smith. This investigation isn't just about Harper, it's about identifying systemic issues within the department." As the investigation progressed, Rebecca found herself inundated with calls and messages. News of the incident had leaked, and the video she recorded had gone viral after her attorney shared it with a trusted journalist. The public outrage was swift and loud, with activists and community leaders demanding justice. Rebecca used the momentum to amplify her voice, participating in interviews and public forums. She shared her story not for sympathy but to shed light on the injustices that persisted in law enforcement. Each retelling was painful, but it was necessary. She refused to let Harper's actions be swept under the rug. The pressure worked. Internal Affairs expedited their investigation, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that stretched far beyond Harper. Emails and text messages revealed a troubling culture of racism and abuse within the department, implicating several officers and even a few supervisors. The findings sent shockwaves through the community, leading to calls for widespread reform. Weeks later, Rebecca received a call from Sheriff Nolan. "Miss Smith, I thought you'd like to know, we've concluded the investigation." "And?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the anticipation building in her chest. "Harper has been terminated. He's also facing criminal charges for misconduct and civil rights violations. Several other officers are under review, and we're implementing new oversight measures to prevent this from happening again." Rebecca closed her eyes, exhaling a long breath. It wasn't a complete victory. No single case could dismantle an entire system of injustice, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with a mix of reporters, activists, local residents, and law enforcement officers. The air was tense, electric with anticipation as the trial of Officer Michael Harper reached its final stage. Rebecca Smith sat quietly at the prosecution's table, her expression composed but her mind racing. This was the culmination of months of humiliation, resilience, and relentless pursuit of justice. Harper, seated across the courtroom at the defense table, appeared a shadow of the arrogant man who had humiliated her on the roadside. The crisp uniform and smug confidence were gone, replaced by a rumpled suit and a nervous energy that radiated from him as he fidgeted with a pen. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Harper barely acknowledged him, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Rebecca's attorney, Eleanor Wright, stood tall and commanding as she delivered her closing argument. Her voice was sharp, slicing through the courtroom with the weight of truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, pacing slowly. "This case is not just about a single moment of abuse. It's about the unchecked arrogance of a man who believed his badge gave him the power to humiliate, intimidate, and degrade another human being solely because of the color of her skin. Officer Harper didn't stop Ms. Smith because she was breaking the law. He stopped her because he believed she didn't belong. He abused his power, and when confronted, he escalated his aggression to outright threats." Eleanor paused, letting her words sink in. The jury's faces were a mixture of outrage and unease as they glanced at Harper. "But this isn't just about Michael Harper," Eleanor continued. "It's about a system that enabled him. A system that ignored repeated complaints against him, that allowed his behavior to go unpunished until he finally crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. This case is an opportunity to send a message that no one is above the law and that accountability applies to everyone, especially those tasked with enforcing it." She turned to Rebecca, her voice softening slightly. "Miss Smith didn't have to be here today. She could have walked away, as so many victims of injustice are forced to do. But she chose to stand up, not just for herself but for every person who has ever been dehumanized by those in power. She recorded the truth. She brought it here. And now it's up to you to ensure justice is done." When the jury filed out to deliberate, Rebecca allowed herself a small exhale. Months of investigation and preparation had led to this moment, but the outcome was still uncertain. Across the room, Harper sat rigidly, his jaw tight and his eyes focused on the table in front of him. The wait was agonizing. Minutes turned into hours as Rebecca replayed the events in her mind. Harper's aggression, his threats, the way his hand had hovered so dangerously close to his weapon. She clenched her fists, remembering the humiliation of standing on the roadside as he searched her car, his every word dripping with disdain. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict slip with steady hands. The judge, an older woman with a commanding presence, nodded for her to proceed. "On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant, Michael Harper, guilty." A ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom, hushed gasps and whispers filling the air. Harper's face blanched, his shoulders sagging as if the words had physically struck him. "On the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant, Michael Harper, guilty." Rebecca's heart pounded. Each guilty verdict felt like a vindication, not just for her, but for the countless others who had suffered similar injustices without the means to fight back. "On the charge of issuing threats, we find the defendant, Michael Harper, guilty." Harper's attorney buried his face in his hands, while Harper himself slumped further in his chair, his head bowing as though he could shrink away from the reality closing in around him. The judge nodded solemnly. "Thank you, members of the jury. I will now proceed with sentencing." The sentencing hearing was swift. Harper's defense team had pleaded for leniency, citing his years of service and the supposed stress of the job. But the prosecution, armed with Harper's history of complaints and the damning video evidence, painted a picture of a man who had repeatedly abused his power and faced no consequences until now. Officer Harper's actions were not the result of a single bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment, Eleanor argued. They were the culmination of a pattern of racism, arrogance, and abuse that has no place in law enforcement. He didn't protect and serve, he humiliated and threatened. The judge's face was impassive as she listened to both sides, but her tone was firm when she addressed Harper directly. "Mr. Harper, as an officer of the law, you were entrusted with the responsibility to uphold justice, not pervert it. Your actions on the night in question were not only a violation of your oath but a betrayal of the community you were sworn to serve." Rebecca watched Harper's face as the judge continued, her words hitting him like hammer blows. This court sentences you to 4 years in prison, the judge concluded. In addition, you will be required to complete racial bias training and anger management counseling during your incarceration. The room erupted in murmurs. Harper's face was a mask of shock and disbelief. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Harper didn't respond. His career, his reputation, and now his freedom, all gone in the span of a single trial. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Activists held signs calling for justice, their cheers echoing as word of the guilty verdict and sentence spread. Rebecca stepped out into the sunlight, her heart heavy but resolute. The fight had taken a toll on her, but it was worth it. Harper's conviction wouldn't undo the pain he had caused, but it was a step toward accountability, a crack in the armor of a system that had shielded men like him for far too long. Sheriff Nolan approached her, his expression serious but respectful. "Miss Smith," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for seeing this through. I know it wasn't easy." Rebecca shook his hand, her grip firm. "It was necessary," she replied. "But the work isn't done. Harper may be behind bars, but there are others like him. The system that allowed him to operate still needs to change." Nolan nodded. "You have my word, we're working on it." As Rebecca walked away, her phone buzzed with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had seen her story. She allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph but of determination. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a larger battle, one she was ready to fight. The fallout from Michael Harper's conviction reverberated far beyond the confines of the courtroom. News outlets across the country picked up the story, replaying clips from Rebecca Smith's harrowing video, the unmistakable evidence of racial bias and abuse of power igniting debates in living rooms, offices, and town halls. The incident became a lightning rod, a symbol of a justice system at a crossroads. And at the center of it all was Rebecca, her name now synonymous with the fight for justice and accountability. Rebecca didn't seek the spotlight, but the spotlight found her. Invitations poured in from universities, advocacy groups, and public forums. People wanted to hear her story, not just the details of that night but her vision for change. At first, she hesitated. Rebecca had always seen herself as a doer, not a speaker. But the faces of those who reached out to her, the mothers who had lost sons, the young professionals who feared driving home at night, the communities trapped in cycles of distrust, convinced her that silence wasn't an option. 3 months after the trial, Rebecca stood on the steps of the state capitol, addressing a crowd of thousands. The crisp autumn air carried her words, amplified by a microphone, to a sea of people holding signs that demanded justice and equality. "This isn't just about one bad officer," Rebecca said, her voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a system that allowed Michael Harper to wear a badge despite years of complaints. It's about a culture that normalized his behavior, that ignored the voices of those he targeted. And it's about making sure this never happens again." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing through the city streets. Rebecca raised a hand to quiet them, her expression resolute. Accountability is only the first step. Real change requires action, reforms that protect the vulnerable, training that confronts bias, and oversight that holds officers to the highest standards. "This isn't just my fight. It's our fight." Rebecca's call for reform sparked a chain reaction. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement. The proposed reforms included mandatory body cameras, independent oversight committees, stricter disciplinary procedures for officers with repeated complaints, and comprehensive anti-bias training programs. Sheriff James Nolan, who had witnessed the fallout of Harper's actions firsthand, became an unexpected ally. He reached out to Rebecca, offering to work with her on implementing changes within his own department. Together, they hosted public forums where community members could voice their concerns and share their experiences with law enforcement. "I can't undo what happened," Nolan said during one of these forums, addressing a packed community center. "But I can commit to making things right moving forward. That starts with listening, to you, to Ms. Smith, and to everyone who's been affected by these failures." Rebecca appreciated Nolan's willingness to take responsibility, but she made it clear that words alone wouldn't suffice. "This is a start," she told him after the forum, But we need to ensure these changes are permanent, not just a response to public pressure. The reforms didn't come without resistance. Police unions pushed back, arguing that the proposed measures unfairly targeted officers and undermined their authority. Protests erupted in some precincts, with officers staging walkouts and refusing to cooperate with the new oversight committees. Rebecca became a lightning rod for criticism, with detractors accusing her of vilifying law enforcement. But Rebecca refused to back down. In interviews and op-eds, she made her position clear. "This isn't about vilifying anyone," she wrote in one widely shared piece. "It's about ensuring that the power entrusted to law enforcement is used to protect, not harm. True accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice." The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Advocacy groups rallied behind Rebecca, amplifying her message and pressuring lawmakers to pass the reforms. Grassroots campaigns sprouted up across the country, each inspired by Rebecca's story and driven by a shared determination to create a more equitable system. Within a year, the impact of the reforms began to show. Departments that had implemented the new measures reported a significant decrease in complaints of misconduct. Communities that had once viewed the police with distrust began to see glimmers of hope as officers attended community events, participated in anti-bias workshops, and engaged in open dialogues. Rebecca, however, knew the work was far from over. She founded the Smith Initiative for Justice and Equality, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for systemic change in law enforcement. The initiative provided legal support for victims of police misconduct, funded research on effective policing practices, and worked to build bridges between law enforcement and the communities they served. Sheriff Nolan became one of the initiative's most vocal supporters, often speaking alongside Rebecca at conferences and workshops. "What happened with Harper wasn't just a failure of one man," Nolan said during a panel discussion. "It was a failure of leadership, a failure of accountability. But it's also a lesson, a painful one, but one that we can learn from if we're willing." Rebecca's efforts also reached the national stage. She testified before Congress, her calm but passionate testimony leaving a lasting impression on lawmakers. She spoke not just about her own experience but about the systemic issues that had allowed it to happen. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty," she told the committee. "It's about creating a system where abuses of power can't thrive. That requires transparency, accountability, and a commitment to seeing every individual as worthy of dignity and respect." Her words sparked bipartisan support for federal legislation that mirrored the reforms she had championed at the state level. When the bill passed, Rebecca stood behind the president as he signed it into law, her name forever tied to the fight for justice. Despite her newfound prominence, Rebecca never forgot the night that had set everything in motion. She kept the video from that night as a reminder, not of the humiliation she had endured but of the strength she had found in standing up to it. It was a strength she carried with her into every meeting, every speech, every interaction. One evening, as she prepared for another event, Rebecca received a call from a young woman who had seen her story online. The woman's voice trembled as she recounted her own experience with police misconduct, one she had never reported out of fear. "Your story gave me hope," the woman said. "Hope that things can change." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as she listened. In that moment, she realized that her fight wasn't just about laws or policies, it was about people. About giving them the courage to stand up, the tools to seek justice, and the belief that change was possible. And so, Rebecca continued to fight, not because the work was easy but because it was necessary. For her, for the young woman on the phone, and for every person who deserved to live in a world where justice and equality weren't just ideals but realities.